Hi everyone, my name is Hassan. I'm a scientist. I'm a contributing editor at the People's Anti-Colonial Press and a co-host of the Culture TV.
I'm Hailey. I'm a historian of the 20th century and Cold War, and I also do the Culture Show with all of you lovely people.
Q, known professionally as Andray Domise. I'm a contributing editor at Maclean's Magazine and a freelance writer.
So today I wanted to have an episode on the legacy of Colin Powell because, he recently died a couple weeks ago. And yeah, I feel like the defining moment of Colin Powell for our generation was the invasion of Iraq. But if you look a little bit deeper into his legacy, Iraq was really what did him in. He resigned after that. But if you look at his legacy, it's marked with, like different cover-ups and, invading other countries under false pretenses. So, Iraq was not unique in any regard. It's just something that it's what we remember him by.
Right. It was a continuation of a pattern in foreign policy that he was kind of instrumental in propping up. Like it was a product of
Exactly.
his, like the way the Vietnam War went down. And like I talked about Vietnam syndrome into like this Afghanistan syndrome, Iraq syndrome that happens. And Colin Powell was like a key player throughout all those decades.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But, as an introduction to Colin Powell, he was a tremendously popular political figure. He was used by the U.S. to legitimize its imperialist adventures abroad. But he was born in Harlem in 1937 to Jamaican immigrant parents. And he actually came from a working class background. His father was a shipping clerk and his mother was a seamstress. And he joined the ROTC while he was a student at City College in New York. And he kind of rose up the ranks. He served 2 tours in Vietnam. And by the time he retired from the military in 1993, Powell was one of the most popular political figures in the U.S. He became the first Black Secretary of State and the first Black Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served as a national security advisor from 1987 to 1989. And, as I said earlier, he lent his considerable credibility to drum up public support for the Iraq War. And I just want to read a couple paragraphs from the CNN article that came out right after he died. Powell was a distinguished and trailblazing professional soldier whose career took him from combat duty in Vietnam to becoming the first Black national security advisor during the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency and the youngest and first African American chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under President George H.W. Bush. His national popularity soared in the aftermath of the U.S.-led coalition victory during the Gulf War, and for a time in the mid-90s, he was considered a leading contender to become the first Black president of the United States. But his reputation would be forever stained when, as George W. Bush's first Secretary of State, he pushed faulty intelligence before the United Nations to advocate for the Iraq War, which he would later call a blot on his record. Bush said in a statement Monday that Powell was a great public servant who was such a favorite of presidents that he earned the Presidential Medal of Freedom twice. He was highly respected at home and abroad, and most important, Colin was a family man and a friend. Though Powell never mounted a White House bid, when he was sworn in as Bush's Secretary of State in 2001, he became the highest-ranking Black public official to date in the country, standing 4th in the presidential line of succession. I think it shows to the world what is possible in this country, Powell said of his history-making nomination during his Senate confirmation hearing. It shows to the world that follow our model, and over a period of time from our beginning, if you believe in the values that you espouse, you can see things as miraculous as me sitting before you to receive your approval. And Hassan, this kind of reminded me of what you talked about in your recent interview with Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. in which he talked about, this ideological project of settler colonial nations to transform people of oppressed nationalities and integrate them into the identity of the settler state and the American project, right? And this is what diversity and inclusion does. It does the opposite of building a national consciousness, like within these oppressed nationalities, these oppressed nations. It breaks up that national consciousness and national unity in order to assimilate them into the American project. And you made a great point how like the military actively recruits Indigenous and Black people, and I think it's a way of integrating people of oppressed nations into the settler nation, and Colin Powell is the textbook example of that.
Yeah, Kwame Ture was extremely critical of Colin Powell, obviously.
Military is an excellent way for a Black person to advance.
I cannot see how anyone can tell me that the best way for one to advance is by being a hired killer. Even I don't see why we have ROTC on campus. We fought to put it off. You mean to tell me the only way we can advance is by being killers and killers of the enemies of American imperialism? Because who do we kill? We don't kill our enemies. Do we go to Azania, South Africa and kill de Klerk? Do we kill the Ku Klux Klan? Do we kill racist policemen? No, we kill Arabs who ain't doing nothing against us. We don't even know them. They've never done anything against us. So it is clear here that Mr. Powell is a liar. Mr. Powell is a traitor to his people, and Mr. Powell is a traitor to humanity, and Mr. Powell accepts that position. That position was made again, and don't you ever forget it, because of Dr. Martin Luther King. If you love King, you can never love Powell.
If you were in a position to advise someone who had attained the position of general in the U.S. Army and was offered the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, what would you have said?
Blow it up.
The Pentagon?
Blow it up.
Obviously, Kwame Ture has not changed in very many respects.
I have changed, please. I'm more knowledgeable, I'm more experienced, and I'm more determined to destroy America.
So, so once he was asked, what do you think of Colin Powell? And Kwame Ture said that Colin Powell is the enemy of the people.
Blow it up.
So Kwame Ture always makes these 2 points. One of them is that individuals never advance on their own, right? They always advance on the struggle of masses, and even for Colin Powell to reach that specific height, the masses had to undergo a certain struggle. But the thing is that the masses are not reaping the benefits of their struggle. The benefits are going to this one individual who is then individually representing an entire group of people. And he's representing them in a way that's against their will, right? Because the larger Black identity in the U.S. has no will to go and invade other countries and be part of this violent project that Colin Powell ends up representing. A big part of the diversity and inclusion project is to integrate people and to ease the contradictions between what we see the legacy of settler colonialism and the legacy of stolen African peoples and replaced indigenous peoples. So diversity and inclusion ends up trying to ease the tensions and contradictions between the legacy of settler colonialism and the legacy of stolen African peoples and replaced indigenous peoples. Ideally, more struggle between these groups implicitly means an anti-colonial struggle and an anti-imperialist struggle. But what the ruling class wants is to merge these groups together and what I like to call forcefully integrate Black and indigenous peoples into the American identity. So we have to think about this historically. First, people were either stolen from their continent of Africa and brought here to the U.S., or they were forcefully removed from their own homes here in the U.S. And that legacy then later translates into them forcefully being integrated into the American identity through ideological projects. And I think the uplifting of Colin Powell into such a high military position is part of that ideological project. One, it says that anyone, even oppressed groups, can make it up into the high ranks of the U.S. and the high ranks of the U.S. are presented as like a great achievement for you to reach, right? And the second thing is that it just hammers in the idea that you are an American. You're not any different. But Kwame Ture was really against this idea. He wanted people to understand, especially Black people in the U.S. He wanted them to understand that they are Africans. They're not Americans, and they should not revel in the idea of ascending up the American military project, which has, resulted in the nuclear bombings of people, resulted in the mass razings of villages and environmental destructions. I don't have to name all of that.
Yeah, and it's something that we're seeing more and more of. Like, for instance, Lloyd Austin was appointed by Biden to be the head of the Pentagon. And he was praised as, being the first Black head of the Pentagon. But, like, whose interests does he really serve when he, like, simultaneously sat on the board of, like, Booz Allen Hamilton and Lockheed Martin at the same time? But yeah, let's talk a little bit about the legacy of Colin Powell. Maybe we should start off with what we remember him for, which was Iraq.
Like I said, Colin Powell has, a decades-long career in, U.S. policymaking, being directly accountable to the White House. After he finishes a second tour in Vietnam, he starts as an advisor in the Nixon White House and then goes from there. So he's party to, setting up the Gulf War, Iran-Contra, Panama, as we'll discuss a little bit later. And it all culminates with the invasion of Iraq. And of course, like, it quite literally could not have been possible without Bush, utilizing Colin Powell's, good favor that he drummed up in the American public to promote the big lie, to establish the big lie. And so in 2003, I believe, or excuse me, it was December of 2002. He gives his famed speech to the United Nations on Iraq possessing weapons of mass destruction, specifically chemical, biological weapons.
I cannot tell you everything that we know, but what I can share with you, when combined with what all of us have learned over the years, is deeply troubling. What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction. None of this should come as a surprise to any of us. Terrorism has been a tool used by Saddam for decades. Saddam was a supporter of terrorism long before these terrorist networks had a name. And this support continues. The nexus of poisons and terror is new. The nexus of Iraq and terror is old. The combination is lethal. With this track record, Iraqi denials of supporting terrorism take their place alongside the other Iraqi denials of weapons of mass destruction. It is all a web of lies. When we confront a regime that harbors ambitions for regional domination, hides weapons of mass destruction, and provides haven and active support for terrorists, we are not confronting the past. We are confronting the present. And unless we act, we are confronting an even more frightening future.
And so nearly every line, and I explained this a little bit in our culture segment on it too, but nearly every line was proven to be false, and he knew that at the time. But later Powell, and there's this whole cowardice. He'll kind of tiptoe around the things that he did, especially later on in life. But there's, this fundamental cowardice, where, he knew a lot more than he ever let on. But he claimed in his book that, all the intel that he was passed from the State Department, the INR, their own internal research division was faulty. But actually, all of that information was pretty clear and good to go. The one thing that was, inaccurate that he might not have known at the time was that his main informant for the research that he used in this speech was from a man named Sheikh al-Libi, who was tortured in Egypt very brutally. And he fed Colin Powell most of the intel, most of the intel that was, later proven to be false. But he actually recanted a week out of being tortured, and the CIA issued a burn notice on his testimony. So they were aware of all this. He said, "I'd have said anything to stop the torture." And this also brings up an interesting kind of full circle moment when it comes to when you think about like the legacy of the Vietnam War and you think about the legacy of the Cold War. It's the institutionalization of torture, and namely, the CIA and the United States exporting torture to, different subcontractors and different regimes abroad. So I just thought that was kind of an ironic moment. But right, he speaks for over an hour, and he's got, the satellite images, which we spoke about, were heavily doctored. He's got tape recordings. He's got the vial of anthrax. But he said that, Iraq had replaced scientists with intelligence agents, which the State Department said was weak and not credible information at the time. He said that Iraq was placing WD experts under house arrest in Saddam's guest houses, which the INR said was highly questionable. Right. And these are not, I mean, I just finished up an interview with Larry Wilkerson, who was his chief of staff and, like his right-hand man through all of these years. And he kind of spoke to how within the different departments, and this is something that you might not get with like a cursory understanding of history, but there's so much intra-department fighting between like the FBI, the CIA, the State Department. And the State Department was often thought to be like the most credible or thorough within that. But I'll get back to that a little bit later. Another big whistleblower from this time was Hussein Kamal, Saddam's son-in-law, who confirmed that Iraq had destroyed chemical weapons long before his defection, but he spun that to say that, it wasn't until Kamal defected that they were destroyed, which, bumps it up by a couple years and makes the threat seem more imminent. And he, capped it off by saying, "Our estimate is that Iraq has between 100 and 500 tons of chemical weapons agent," which again, proven to be destroyed or confirmed to be destroyed, but the U.S. actually provided and helped Iraq manufacture the nerve agents that they were citing. So this speech was absolutely crucial in manufacturing consent for the war, because when you think about the lead up to the Iraq War, not the lead up, but I mean, one of the major consequences was the death of the U.S. anti-war movement writ large. And it's because of this big lie, like pro-war sentiment went from about a third to over half of the American public after Powell spoke out in favor of it. And Joe Biden was even so impressed that he said he'd like to, nominate him to run for president. And I actually found earlier when I was researching this that apparently Colin Powell got like 3 electoral votes in the 2016 election. So people stay voting for this motherfucker. So it's crazy how easily he could have become president. But he didn't really need to be president to have a really powerful effect on our foreign policy and, needlessly end the lives of millions of civilians, or at least have a major part in it. But the thing about the 90... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I don't think it can be overstated that this was like his 2003 speech to the UN Security Council. It was the turning point in the lead up to the war. At that time, public opinion was like very much against the invasion of Iraq. But they used Colin Powell to turn public opinion in favor of it. And at that time, a lot of Black people that were polled were against the invasion, but Powell, used his position and his political clout and political legitimacy to drum up support. So he was instrumental, very much so, in the invasion of Iraq.
Right. And there's like we use girl boss for, women who kind of get wrapped up in the military industrial complex and promote its interest under like the guise of some sort of inclusivity, but there's like not really an equivalent word for like the racial aspect of that. But Colin Powell is very much a product of this like de-racialization of like prominent black political figures, where like their, you know, physical identity as a black person ends up having no real bearing on like their relationships to, you know, capital and like military and like imperial interests. So it's really interesting, and we can tie that all the way back to his history of service in Vietnam, and what was going on, the dynamics of the U.S. military at that time. But I can get to that whenever you'd like. But we all know, like, or we're just starting to come to grips with like the massive human costs of what we call the global wars on terror. And around 200,000 Iraqi civilians were killed as a result of direct violence from the invasion, and it's impossible to quantify how many more were killed as an indirect result. I mean, to this day, Iraq's, you know, medical infrastructure overall, like water, sanitation, things like that, it's still absolutely in shambles, and most Iraqi people do not have access to clean water, and a lot of them not any access to safe housing. And you know, we not only raised this country to the ground, but we, you know, invested $100 billion afterwards in the region as, you know, kind of part of this extended occupation cleanup effort for infrastructure and recovery. But it turned into things like the Coalition Provisional Authority, where all of the money that was set aside for education, for healthcare, for, you know, humanitarian purposes magically disappeared, and the only checks that ended up being cashed were for defense contractors. So it's kind of like this vicious cycle of tearing through a country militarily and then setting up some sort of establishment there that fails to address like the human or root cause of what we supposedly invaded for. You know, gives us an opportunity to cash in on those weapons, and then all of a sudden, when the country becomes destabilized because we never were really stabilizing in the first place, then we just do it all over again. So it's very interesting. And also going back to the torture thing, the Abu Ghraib torture facility, right, the notorious, where we detained many people without cause for years and years and years, killed, tortured, raped. Colin Powell was at the meeting where they determined the exact enhanced interrogation techniques that would be used. And I mean, this whole legacy of torture starts with the Phoenix program during Vietnam, but it's really ramped up during these years, and Colin Powell was instrumental in making that a thing. And we still, to this day, operate dozens and dozens of black sites around the world. We can't even keep track of who's being tortured and to what ends, because we exported it and it started getting out of control, which is, you know, how Al-Qaeda became a threat to us when we were actually using them in covert operations in Bosnia and Azerbaijan. I mean, a lot of people know about the link between like Reagan, Carter, and the Mujahideen, but not so many people know just how closely we were working with Al-Qaeda, like right up until 9/11, basically. And that's something that maybe find on my page or go to Covert Action, where in the Wilkerson interview we talk about that at length, if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, it's all kind of coming back full circle. Also, I